The wind was a thief in Lantern Step Canyon. It stole the warmth from the late afternoon sun, scoured the red dust from the canyon floor, and flung it against anything that dared to stand. It howled a lonely, mournful tune through the rock formations that gave the place its name. Stone pillars worn by millennia into the shape of forgotten stairways to a pale, indifferent sky. The sign for Thornbrush Flats, nailed to a weathered cottonwood, surrendered to the assault, squealing on its rusty hinges like an animal caught in a trap. Each shriek was another nail in the coffin of a dying day. Beckett Vale felt the grit of the wind between his teeth. At 34, his face was already a map of the land he worked, lines etched around his eyes from squinting into that same sun. His skin tanned the color of worn leather. He stood on the edge of the diversion dam, a sturdy but aging structure of timber and packed earth that was the lifeblood of his ranch. Juniper Row. His boots were planted firm, but his gut was uneasy. The water level in the feeder ditch was wrong. It was dangerously low, a sluggish, muddy trickle where a steady, gurgling flow should have been. The cottonwoods downstream, the ones that shaded his modest homestead, already looked thirsty, their leaves drooping with a premature autumn weariness. He crouched, his gloved fingers tracing the damper, dark line on the wooden sluice gate. The water had been this low for at least a day, maybe two. A dry spell was one thing. Nature was a fickle partner you learned to dance with. This felt different. This felt like a hand closing around his throat. His gaze followed the main channel. Bristlecone Wash, snaking its way up the canyon toward the high country. Up there, the snowmelt should still be feeding the springs. There was no reason for the wash to be this weak. Then he saw them. Cut deep into the soft earth of the ditch bank were tracks. Not the familiar prints of deer or the wandering trail of a coyote. These were twin ruts, deep and straight, pressed into the ground by heavy, iron-rimmed wheels. A freight wagon, a heavy one. It had pulled right up to the head of his ditch, crushing the wild primrose that grew along the bank. Anger, cold and sharp, pricked at him. Someone had been here. Someone with a heavy wagon and no good reason to be this far up his private waterway. He followed the tracks, his long strides eating up the ground. They led away from his dam and further up the main wash. A clear, damming trail pointing toward the source. Someone had choked Bristlecone Wash. Someone had deliberately cut the flow upstream, starving every ranch and farmstead that depended on its charity. And in this part of the territory, starving a man's water was no different than putting a gun to his head. It was just a slower way to kill him. A new sound cut through the wind's constant moan. It wasn't the creak of the sign or the rustle of dry sage. It was the frantic, desperate drumming of horses' hooves, hammering against the hardpan somewhere down canyon. The sound was too fast for a casual rider, too ragged for a messenger. It was the sound of flight. Beckett straightened, his hand instinctively going to the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. He scanned the haze of red dust. A figure emerged, a lone rider pushing their mount with a reckless urgency that churned the air. As the rider drew closer, he could make out the shape of a woman, her body bent low over the horse's neck, a dark traveling cloak billowing out behind her like broken wings. She rode straight for him, not for the trail that led to his ranch house. Her horse, a fine-boned sorrel mare lathered in sweat and trembling with exhaustion, stumbled to a halt just feet from him. The rider slid from the saddle before the animal had even stopped moving, her legs nearly buckling beneath her. It was Nora Winter. He knew her, though not well. A widow from a small holding over in Alderwick Hollow. A place that kept to itself. He'd seen her in town a few times, always with a quiet dignity about her. A reserved woman with eyes that seemed to hold a world of unspoken thoughts. There was nothing quiet or reserved about her now. Her cloak was torn at the shoulder. Her hair had come loose from its pins and whipped across her face in a wild, tangled mess. Dust clung to her eyelashes and streaked her cheeks where tears had run. She clutched one hand to her chest, holding something tight against her body. Her chest rose and fell in great, gulping breaths that were closer to sobs. "Vale," she gasped, her voice a raw, broken thing. He took a step toward her. "Mrs." Winter. What is it? What's happened? She ignored the question. Her eyes, wide with a terrifying mix of desperation and defiance, locked on his. She took a staggering step forward and uncurled the hand she'd held so tightly against her chest. "I took it off," she whispered, the words almost stolen by the wind. "Please." In her palm lay a simple gold wedding band. It wasn't new or shiny. It was worn smooth in places, covered in a web of tiny scratches that spoke of years of hard work, of kneading dough and mending fences. She didn't offer it to him. She pressed it into his hand. Her fingers were ice cold and trembled against his skin. The metal felt heavy, a burden of immense weight. Beckett froze. He stared down at the ring, then back at her face. This was not a plea for help. It was a renunciation, a severing. The look in her eyes challenged every notion he had of the quiet widow from the hollow. There was terror there. Yes, but beneath it burned an ember of pure, unyielding steel. She was a woman pushed to the very edge of her world, and she had decided to fight back with the only thing she had left to give away. "They're coming," she choked out, her gaze darting back down the canyon. "Silas Drover and Judge Pike." The names hit Beckett like a physical blow. Drover was the largest landowner in the county, a man who collected ranches like other men collected stamps, his greed as vast and empty as the territory itself. Judge Horace Pike was the law in Thornbrush Flats, but everyone knew it was Drover's law he upheld. The two of them together were a plague, a blight on the land that choked out smaller, honest folk. "They're accusing me." Nora's voice trembled with a rage that shook her entire frame. Of indecency. They've fabricated letters. They claim I've been unfaithful to my husband's memory. Her husband, a good man named Thomas, had been dead for 2 years, taken by a fever. It's a lie. A filthy lie to invoke the morality clause on my deed. They want my land. They want my water rights. It was a common enough tactic for predators like Drover use the law as a club to beat a vulnerable woman into submission. A widow accused of adultery, true or not, would be a pariah. The court, presided over by Drover's pawn, would strip her of her property in the name of public decency. She would be left with nothing. From the distant ridge, a new sound echoed, thin and sharp against the wind, the call of a posse horn. It was E.P.H. Deeks, the town's deputy and another one of Drover's pet dogs. They weren't just accusing her, they were hunting her. There was no time to think, no time to weigh the consequences. There was only the woman standing before him, shaking and broken, but for the fire in her eyes, and the ring growing warm in his hand. There was only the sound of the hunt getting closer. Beckett's decision was instant, born of an instinct older than law, older than property deeds. It was the instinct to shelter, to protect. "This way," he said, his voice low and firm. He grabbed her arm, his touch gentle but insistent, and pulled her toward the collection of outbuildings near the dam. The old grain silo stood apart from the main barn, a squat, windowless cylinder of weathered pine. He practically shoved her toward the heavy plank door. Inside. "Now." He fumbled with the thick iron latch, his fingers stiff with cold and urgency. The door groaned open into a cavern of shadow and the thick, dusty smell of old harvests. He pushed her into the darkness, followed her in, and pulled the heavy door shut behind them. The sliver of angry red daylight vanished, plunging them into an almost total blackness. He shot the heavy wooden crossbar into place, the solid thump of the bar seating in its iron brackets echoing in the sudden, suffocating silence. A single lantern sat on a crate, its wick trimmed low. Beckett cupped his hand around the glass chimney and blew. The flame sputtered and died, and the last vestige of light was gone. The world outside ceased to exist. All that remained was the small, dark space and the sensory details that flooded the void. The air was thick with the scent of pine resin from the silo walls and the faint, sweet smell of spilled grain that had worked its way into the very wood. Dust motes, disturbed by their entry, tickled his throat. Nora had stumbled against him in the dark. and he could feel the frantic, rabbit-quick beat of her heart against his arm. Her breathing was ragged and loud in the confined space. He realized his own was no calmer. He reached out, his hand finding her shoulder. He could feel her trembling beneath the rough fabric of her cloak. Outside, the posse arrived. The jingle of harnesses and the creak of saddle leather were sharp, predatory sounds. Hooves crunched on the gravel right outside the silo door, so close he could feel the vibration through the soles of his boots. He was just here. A man's voice growled. It was Deke's. The tracks lead right to the dam. Nora made a small, choked sound, and Beckett could feel her tense, ready to bolt. In the pitch black, he could visualize her biting her lip, a habit he'd noticed in town when she was nervous. Now, she was likely biting it hard enough to taste the metallic tang of blood. He tightened his grip on her shoulder, a silent command to stay still. Spread out. Deeks ordered. Check the barn. The spring house. He can't have gone far. Drove her once that woman found before nightfall. The sounds of the search party moved away, boots crunching on the dry ground, the muffled thud of a barn door being kicked open. But one man remained, his horse snorting restlessly just beyond their hiding place. For an eternity, there was only the sound of the wind, their own ragged breathing, and the impatient scrape of a horseshoe on stone. The shadow of a man holding a lantern passed over a thin crack near the floor, a fleeting ghost of light that made the darkness that followed seem even deeper. Then, finally, the lone rider grunted in frustration and trotted off to join the others. The silence they left behind was heavier than the noise had been. Nora sagged against him, a shudder running through her. The immediate danger had passed, but the true threat remained, vast and organized. Beckett let the silence stretch, allowing their heart rates to slow, their breathing to even out. He could feel the warmth of her body through their clothes, a small point of life in the cold. Dusty dark. He was hiding a fugitive. He was standing against Silas Drover and the so-called law. He had crossed a line, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that there was no going back. His fight over water had just become her fight for her life, and maybe they were one and the same. He leaned closer, his mouth near her ear so he wouldn't have to raise his voice above a whisper. He felt a stray strand of her hair brush against his cheek. "I'll get you out of here," he said, the words a low, solemn vow in the darkness. "But it's going to be a risk. The half-life of terror is long. Long after the clatter of the posse faded. Long after the heavy silence of the silo settled in. The adrenaline remained, a metallic taste in their mouths." Beckett waited, counting off minutes that stretched into an hour, straining his ears against the pine walls. There was only the wind, reclaiming its dominion over the canyon. When he finally slid the heavy crossbar back, the sound was like a gunshot in the stillness. The evening air was sharp and cold. The sun had bled out behind the western ridge, leaving the sky a deep, bruised purple. He moved first, his revolver in hand, scanning the empty yard around the dam. The posse was gone, their tracks already blurring in the dusk. He signaled to Nora. She emerged from the silo like a ghost, her face pale, her eyes huge and dark in the twilight. "They'll be back," he said, his voice quiet. "Or they'll leave Deeks to watch the main road. We can't use the horse." He led her not to his main ranch house, which was too visible from the trail, but to the original sod-roofed bunkhouse tucked into a fold in the land, its low profile hidden by a stand of juniper and willow. He settled her inside, lit a small, shielded lamp, and barred the door. "Stay here. Don't show a light. Don't leave for any reason." He handed her a canteen and a strip of jerky. "I'll be back before dawn." She grabbed his sleeve. "Where are you going, hunting?" Beckett said. "You saw their tracks. I need to see their work." He was gone before she could protest. He spent the night in the hills, cold and restless, watching his own property from the high ground. When the first hint of gray light touched the eastern peaks, he moved, not downstream toward his ranch, but upstream, following the muddy, weeping trail of bristlecone wash. He followed it for 2 miles, his boots sinking in the damp sand. The tracks of the heavy wagon were easy to follow. They veered off the main wash, following a smaller, seasonal tributary that cut through a narrow rock chute. And there it was. It was an ugly, brutal thing. A fresh dam, built not of timber and smart engineering, but of raw earth, felled pine, and hastily piled rock. It was a plug, plain and simple, thrown across the tributary with a savage efficiency. It choked the water, diverting the entire flow into a newly dug channel that headed east, away from Lantern Step Canyon and toward the vast, dry holdings of Silas Drover. Beckett scrambled down the bank, his anger a cold, hard knot in his stomach. This wasn't just a diversion. It was theft on a grand scale. He saw the marks of a dozen shovels, the splintered stumps of freshly cut trees. They had worked fast, and they had worked at night, on the highest, most central boulder of the dam. A crude stencil had been painted in stark, white paint. It was a circle containing 3 letters O or F. Ormond Rail Freight. The name hit him like a chill. Franklin Ormond, the smooth, Eastern-educated agent for the railroad. A man who had been sniffing around Thornbrush Flats for months, promising prosperity while buying up right-of-ways. So Drover wasn't acting alone. He had the railroad for a partner. Ormond and the railroad needed water for their steam engines and their work crews. Drover needed the neighboring ranches to fail so he could absorb them. They were starving the whole valley to feed their twin ambitions. He knelt by the muddy edge of the new dam, examining the earth. It was different from the sandy loam of the wash. This was a thick, gray-blue clay, slick and tacky. It smelled faintly sour, like vinegar. He recognized it. It was clay laced with alum, a mineral that wasn't found naturally in this part of the canyon. Alum made clay bind, made it pack hard and fast, making an earthen dam cure in days instead of weeks. They had hauled this material in, likely from the railroad's own quarry over by Cathedral Butte. This was premeditated, supplied, and executed with corporate resources. This was not a simple water dispute. This was a conspiracy. He returned to the bunkhouse as the sun was clearing the ridge. Nora was sitting on the edge of the cot, the woolen blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. She looked up when he entered, and the question in her eyes was so stark, so full of dread, that he answered it before she could speak. "It's worse than we thought. They've dammed the tributary. It's Franklin Ormond, the railroad." Nora's hands went to her mouth. "Ormond," she whispered. The name seemed to confirm a fear she hadn't dared to voice. "Then it's true. It's all connected." "What's connected Alderwick Hollow?" she said, her voice gaining a frantic edge. "My home. 2 weeks ago. Judge Pike posted riders. They put up signs. We've been quarantined." Beckett frowned. "Quarantined for what dysentery? They claim the wells in the hollow are contaminated. Is it true? Are people sick?" "No," she said, shaking her head. "That's the lie. Not one person has so much as a fever, but the wells, they are going dry. Just like your ditch. Because the hollow is fed by the same watershed. Pike declared it a public health crisis. He's forbidden anyone from leaving or entering. And he posted a notice of public condemnation. He's using the quarantine to seize the land for pennies on the dollar, claiming it's unfit for habitation." The pieces slammed together in Beckett's mind. It was a brilliant, vicious strategy. Ormond builds a secret dam, cutting off the water. The wells and ditches run dry. Pike, citing the drought and faking a health crisis, condemns the land, and Drover, the benevolent savior, steps in to buy the worthless property from the sick families, offering them just enough to get out of the territory. Ormond gets the water rights for his railroad, and Drover gets all the land. "And you," Beckett said, looking at her with a new, dawning horror. "They framed you to silence you, to discredit the one person who might fight back." Nora nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I'm a widow, Mr. Vale, alone, an easy target. If I'm branded an indecent woman, no one will listen to my claims. Pike will seize my land and no one in town will raise a hand to help me." His gaze fell to the gold band still clutched in his fist. He had shoved it in his pocket and forgotten it. He pulled it out, the metal warm from his body. "This," he said, holding it out. "You said—" "I took it off." Nora looked at the ring, her expression hardening. My husband, Thomas, has been gone for 2 years. I kept wearing this." Her voice dropped, thick with a shame that angered him on her behalf. Not for him, but for me. As a shield. You know how men in these parts look at a widow. They see opportunity, an unclaimed property. The ring kept them at bay. It kept the gossip quiet. She met his eyes. Then Drover and Pike turned my shield into their weapon. They are using this, my loyalty to my husband's memory, to destroy me. They claim I've defiled it. When I rode out of the hollow, I knew I couldn't run as Thomas Winter's widow. She's a victim. She's the woman they created in their lies. She reached out and deliberately, gently, closed his fingers back around the ring. I took it off to cut the last tie to the past they are using to bind me. I won't be Mrs. Winter, the fallen widow. I will be Nora, and I will fight them. Beckett stared at her, seeing for the first time the woman who had been hiding behind the widow's weeds. This was not the person he'd seen in town. This was someone new, forged in the fire of injustice. "The quarantine signs?" she said, her mind suddenly racing on a new track. "The public notices. They were posted by Judge Pike. But the seals, they looked official, federal seals." "How could you know before I married Thomas?" Nora said, a spark of the old, quiet woman returning. "I was not a rancher's wife. I was Nora Winter, the county archivist in Silver Switch Junction. I worked in the clerk's office for 4 years. My job was paper. I managed land deeds, territorial charters, water ledgers. I know the feel of government bond paper. I know the smell of regulation ink. And I know Mr. Vale, the precise impression of a federal marshal's seal versus a cheap forgery." Beckett felt a surge of something he hadn't realized. He was missing hope. She wasn't just a victim he had to protect. She was a weapon. "The water ledgers," he said, moving to an old roll-top desk in the corner of the bunkhouse. "I keep the old survey logs from the dry lantern station here." He pulled out a stack of thick, leather-bound volumes, their pages filled with columns of spidery script and numbers, recording the flow of the wash for the last 20 years. They spread the books open on the small table. Beckett ran his finger down the columns for the last 5 years. "It's been dry before," he muttered. "See 71 and 73. The levels dropped almost this low." "No," Nora said, leaning in close, her hair brushing his sleeve. She pointed to a figure in the log for 1873. "Look at this." He squinted. It was just a number. "What the ink?" she breathed. "It's different. This 3 is heavier. The ink is blacker than the 7 next to it. And here—" She turned a page, her fingers tracing a line of data from 1871. "Hold this to the light." He held the brittle page up to the lamp. She was right. In one spot, the paper was thinner, almost translucent. "It's been scraped," she whispered, her eyes alight with the thrill of discovery. Someone took a knife and scraped the original number off the page, then wrote a new, lower number over it. But they scraped too hard. They damaged the paper fiber. She moved through the books, page after page. They're all like this, smudges, altered figures, ink blots where there shouldn't be any. They haven't just built a dam. Beckett, they've been rewriting history for months. They've been manufacturing a historical drought on paper to match the one they're creating in the valley. The methodical, patient evil of it settled on him. This was a war, and they had only just found the battlefield. "Ormond," Nora said suddenly, looking up from the ledger. "It was him. I saw him. What are you talking about 3 weeks ago? I couldn't sleep. The air was too still. I was sitting on my porch, and I heard something. A handcar. On the railroad tracks that run past Cathedral Butte. It was late, almost 2 in the morning. A work crew. No, it was quiet. Just one car, moving fast. It was Ormond. I saw him clearly in the moonlight. Him and one other man, pumping the handle. I thought it was strange, but I dismissed it. What business was it of mine? Her face hardened. He was coming back from the dry lantern station. After this, she slapped the open ledger. He falsified the records, then went up the tributary to build his dam. They had him. They had the means, the motive, and the man, but it was her word against the combined power of a judge, a railroad baron, and the biggest landowner in the territory. "We need proof," Beckett said. "Proof that can't be argued away." He looked toward the window, toward the high, jagged peaks of the Needleback Ridge. "We have to go back to that dam. We have to map it, measure it. We need drawings. We need samples of that clay. We need to prove, in a courtroom, that it's a new construction." "I'm coming with you," Nora said. "It wasn't a request. It's too dangerous. You're the one they're hunting." "And I'm the one who knows paper," she countered, her voice firm. "You know the land, but I know the evidence. You'll need me to document what we find. You'll be looking for a fight. I'll be looking for the details that win one." He looked at her for a long moment, this woman who had transformed from a terrified refugee into a determined investigator. He nodded once. "All right, but we can't go in blind, and we can't do it alone. I need to go to town. I need to see a friend." He rode into Thornbrush Flats an hour later, keeping to the alleys, his hat pulled low. He bypassed the main street, tying his horse in a narrow lane behind the Copper Canary, a saloon that was quieter and more respectable than the rowdy Ace of Cinders across the street. He went in through the back kitchen, nodding to the cook. He found Maeve Cartwright behind her polished oak bar, wiping glasses. Maeve was a woman in her late 50s, with iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. She was, as Beckett knew, the true center of the town. She was its eyes, its ears, and often its conscience. She saw him in the bar mirror and didn't turn around. "You're either brave or a fool to be in town today. Beckett Vale, EPH Deeks has been telling everyone you assaulted him and abducted the widow Winter." "He's lying," Beckett said, sliding onto a stool. "Of course he is," Maeve said, finally turning. Her sharp eyes scanned his face. "But the law's on his side. What's the truth?" He told her. He spoke in a low, rapid voice, laying out the dam. The ORF stencil, the quarantine, the falsified ledgers. Maeve listened, her expression growing colder with every word. When he finished, she placed a clean glass on the bar with a sharp click. "Franklin Ormond," she hissed. "That smooth-talking snake. I knew he was rotten. And Pike, I've seen him and Drover with their heads together for weeks." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You're right. They're partners. And they're meeting tomorrow night. How do you know my girl Sadie, who serves cards at the Ace of Cinders?" She heard them. Ormond and Judge Pike. A private meeting in the back room. After midnight. Drover won't be there, but his shadow will be. This was it. The moment to set the trap. "Maeve," Beckett said, leaning in. "I need you to start a rumor." She raised a silver eyebrow. "I'm not a gossip. Beckett, you're a tactical distributor of information," he countered. "I need you to let slip, to someone you know will repeat it directly to Drover's men, that I'm broken. Broken. Tell them the drought has hit me so hard I'm desperate. Tell them I'm looking to sell my water rights. All of them. And that I'm taking offers." Maeve's sharp gaze turned into a slow, appreciative smile. "Ah, you're rattling the cage. If they think you're about to sell your rights to a third party, it could ruin their entire plan. They'd have to secure their own fraudulent claims immediately. They'll have to move up their timeline. They'll get sloppy. Exactly. It might force Ormond and Pike to put something on paper tomorrow night, something we can use. It's a dangerous game," Maeve warned. "You're painting a target on your own back." "They already painted it," Beckett said, standing up. "I'm just choosing the battlefield." He slid out of the saloon, melting back into the shadows of the alley. The sun was high. The town looked peaceful. Families moving along the boardwalks. But beneath the surface, the rot was spreading. The bait was set. Tomorrow night, the rats would gather. And tonight, he and Nora had a ridge to climb. Night had claimed the canyon, swallowing the red rock and dusty trails in a pool of absolute black. There was no moon, only a cold, indifferent scattering of stars that offered no comfort and even less light. It was a cold that bit deep, a high desert cold that found its way through denim and wool. Beckett Vale moved through the sagebrush like a shadow, his body low to the ground, his movements patient and fluid. He was accustomed to this. He had hunted coyote and stalked deer in this very darkness. Behind him, Nora Winter moved with less grace but equal determination. The sharp, aromatic scent of crushed sage filled the air with every step they took, a pungent perfume that covered the sound of their own breathing. The dry branches snagged at her clothes, and the sharp gravel of the arroyo floor bit at her hands and knees. But she made no sound of complaint. Her focus was absolute, fixed on the dark shape of Beckett's back. Ahead, the dam loomed. It was a raw wound on the landscape, a blacker mound of earth against the black hills. The only light came from 2 storm lanterns, placed on boulders at either end of the crude structure. They cast a weak, flickering yellow glow, illuminating 2 men, hired guards, their rifles leaning casually against the rocks, the red embers of their cigarettes glowing and fading in the dark. The pooled water behind the dam was a flat, dead mirror, black as oil, reflecting the pinprick stars above. Beckett held up a hand. Nora froze. They were at the edge of the scrub line, about 100 yards from the dam itself. The guards were talking, their voices carrying clearly on the thin night air, cold enough to freeze the devil's heart. One of them griped. His name was Jeb. Quiet. The other, Abel, snapped. "You're paid to watch, not to whine. Drover wants this place sealed tight. Sealed from what ghosts? Ain't nobody dumb enough to come up here." Beckett watched them for a full 10 minutes, tracking their movements. They were lazy. They paced the length of the dam, met in the middle to share a flask, then retreated to their respective lanterns to huddle against the cold. Their patrols were irregular, their attention focused more on their own comfort than on the surrounding darkness. "Now," Beckett whispered. He didn't move toward the dam, but laterally, down toward the newly formed water's edge, keeping a large granite outcropping between them and the guards. The ground here was soft, a thick, cold mud that sucked at their boots. They reached the edge of the new reservoir. This was the proof Beckett needed. He uncoiled a thin rope from his belt. Attached to the end was a wooden spike, its side marked with carved notches. A simple surveyor's tool. He had to get a true measure of the water level. He handed the rope to Nora. "Hold this. If I tug, let it go slack, but don't drop it." He slid down the bank until the icy water lapped at his knees. He waded in, the mud pulling at his boots, his breath hissing between his teeth. He moved with agonizing slowness, his eyes fixed on the distant lantern. He reached the center of the tributary, held the spike against the dam wall, and with the heavy butt of his Colt, he quietly, firmly, tapped it into the packed earth, setting it deep. The top of the spike was level with the water's surface. It was a permanent marker, a testament to the lie. This was no drought. This was a flood, contained. He gave a slight tug, and Nora paid out the line, letting him return to the bank without a splash. He scrambled up next to her, shivering, his jeans soaked to the thigh. Nora didn't pause. It was her turn. She moved to the very edge of the bank, where the water met the dry land. She took a long, dark pin from the tight bun of her hair. It was her only tool. She knelt, her hands sinking into the freezing, viscous mud. Beckett watched, his respect for her growing with every steady movement. She wasn't just feeling the mud. She was measuring. She pressed the hairpin down into the bank, just at the waterline. It sank easily, almost 2 inches, before hitting the firmer, drier ground beneath. She pulled it out, wiped it clean on a clump of grass, and moved a foot up the bank, away from the water. She pressed the pin down again. This time, it hit hard-packed, dry earth immediately. She looked up at him, her eyes bright in the darkness. "This silt," she whispered, her voice trembling with the cold and the discovery. "It's new. It's soft, uncompressed. It was laid down in the last few days. The original bank is right underneath." She had her proof. The archivist had read the land as clearly as she'd read the doctored ledgers. A sound split the night. Not a human voice, not a coyote. It was the sharp, piercing caw of a crow. 3 times. It was a signal. "Down," Beckett ordered. He grabbed her arm and pulled her into the deepest shadow available, a dark void beneath a massive stone abutment that anchored the dam to the canyon wall. It was a cramped, triangular space, smelling of damp rock and spiderwebs. They pressed themselves flat against the cold granite, their backs to the wall, their bodies hidden from the dam itself. New sounds, boots on gravel, coming from the trail above, the changing of the guard. "Nothing to report?" Abel, a new voice, asked. "Nothing but Jeb complaining," Abel's voice replied. Much closer now. They were standing almost directly above their hiding place. "It's quiet. Too quiet. You always say that. You're paid for 4 hours. Go get your sleep." The footsteps of the first 2 guards receded. 2 new men took their place. One of them, the one who had just arrived, was more thorough. His lantern swung in a low arc, its beam cutting across the rocks. "What's this?" the new guard said. Beckett felt Nora tense beside him. He put a warning hand on her arm. "What's what?" the other guard grumbled. "Tracks, down here in the mud." The lantern beam moved, coming to rest on the bank, just feet from their hiding spot. It illuminated the series of small, precise holes Nora had made with her hairpin, and next to them, the unmistakable, small, and very clear print of her boot. "Well, I'll be," the guard muttered. He crouched, bringing the lantern dangerously close. "That's a small print. Too small for a man. Looks like a woman's boot." In the cramped darkness, Nora's breath hitched. It was an involuntary gasp, tiny, almost silent. But to Beckett, it was as loud as a scream. In her panic, she shifted her weight, dislodging a small pebble. It rattled, a minuscule sound, skittering down the rock face and landing with a soft plip in the mud. The guard's head snapped up. "Who's there?" he barked, his other hand grabbing his rifle. He took a step toward the abutment, raising the lantern high. The yellow light was about to spill into their hiding place. There was no time for thought, only instinct. In one explosive, silent motion, Beckett moved. He didn't draw his gun. He seized Nora by the shoulders and pulled her against him. Hard. He twisted his body, putting himself between her and the opening, and simultaneously threw the heavy wool of his duster cloak up and over her head, enveloping them both in a pocket of absolute, suffocating darkness. He pressed her face into his chest, his left arm clamped around her back, holding her so tightly she couldn't move, couldn't make a sound. The world dissolved. For Nora. There was no guard, no dam, no cold. There was only the sudden, shocking impact against a body as solid as the rock behind them. The air was knocked from her lungs, her gasp smothered against the rough wool of his shirt. She was surrounded by the smell of him leather, cold night air, dust, and a faint, clean scent of pine soap. She could feel the frantic, heavy thump-thump of his heart hammering against her ear, a rhythm so powerful it seemed to shake them both. The lantern light washed over the outside of the cloak, turning the wool a dull, translucent brown for a split second. And then it was gone. "You're spooking at shadows." "Eli," the other guard said, his voice full of boredom. "It was a rock fall. This whole pile of dirt is settling. Now come on, I want to smoke." The light moved away. The footsteps receded. Beckett didn't move. He held her, rigid, for a full minute, listening. His entire body was a shield. Nora was trembling, but not from the cold. It was the shock, the adrenaline, the terrifying, absolute protection of the last 30 seconds. The warmth from his body was a furnace, seeping through her clothes, a stark contrast to the icy granite at her back. He felt her relax, just barely. She whispered, her voice muffled against his shirt. "I'm fine." But her hand, which had been trapped between them, fisted, clutching a handful of his shirt in a grip so tight her knuckles ached. She didn't let go. Finally. Slowly. Beckett released his hold. He let the cloak fall, pulling back just enough for her to breathe. The darkness of the alcove felt normal again. His voice was a low growl, rougher than before. "We're not done." He pointed, not with his finger, but with his chin. There. Now that their eyes were fully adjusted to the dark, and with the guard safely on the far side of the dam, They could see what Beckett had spotted: a key piece of the dam's construction, a massive timber, a structural support beam driven deep into the canyon wall, acting as the main brace for the earthen wall. And on it, stark and unmistakable, was the stencil: ORF SEC.12 Franklin Orman's initials, Section 12. This was the railroad's work, branded and catalogued. This was the nail in their coffin. "I have to copy it," Nora whispered. She was all business again. The archivist resurfacing. "It's too dark." "No." She pulled a small, leather-bound notebook and a pencil stub from her cloak pocket. "Just give me a target. I need to copy the style, the break in there, the way the F is slanted." It was too risky to use a match. Beckett scanned the area. The guard's lantern, a good 50 yards away, cast just enough ambient light. "Stay here," he ordered. He slid from the alcove, moving to the timber. He positioned his body to block the guard's view, creating a shadow. "Now." "Nora, quick!" She was beside him in an instant. She didn't look at the guards. She didn't look at anything but the stencil. Her fingers, though numb with cold, moved with a scholar's precision. She wasn't just writing the letters, she was drawing them, meticulously replicating the stenciled font, the uneven bleeding of the paint, the exact spacing. She was capturing a perfect forgery of their guilt. "Got it," she breathed, snapping the book shut. It was then that the alarm came. It wasn't a shout. It was a horn, a hunting horn, its long, baying note echoing from down canyon. It was a signal of pursuit. Maeve's rumor had worked too well. Or perhaps their absence from the bunkhouse had been discovered. The guards on the dam heard it. What in tarnation? That's the signal from the main road. A lantern was raised high. "Hey, who's down there? They had been seen." The shift in shadows as they'd moved from the alcove was enough. A warning shot tore through the night. The bullet zinged off the granite abutment, spraying stone chips where they had been hiding seconds before. "Run," Beckett yelled. There was no stealth now. He grabbed Nora's hand, yanking her away from the dam. They didn't go back the way they came. He hauled her toward the opposite side of the canyon, toward a deep, dry gully, that cut a jagged scar down the mountainside. Another shot. The bullet whined past Nora's ear, so close she felt the heat of its passage. They didn't run. They dove. Beckett threw himself and Nora over the edge of the embankment. They tumbled into the gully, a chaotic slide of loose rock, thorny bushes, and scraping pain. They landed in a heap at the bottom, in a darkness so complete it was like being buried. Above them, men were shouting. Lantern beams sliced frantically through the night, but they were too low, too deep in the earth's shadow to be seen. They lay there for a moment, gasping for air, their lungs burning, their hands and knees raw. They were alive, and they had the proof. Beckett pushed himself up onto his elbows. "Are you hurt?" "No," Nora panted, pushing her hair out of her face. Just scraped." They scrambled to their feet and began to run, using the gully as a hidden trench, putting distance between themselves and the chaos of the dam. After a half-mile, when their legs were burning and the shouts had faded behind them, they collapsed behind a stand of mesquite. Nora leaned back against the rock, her chest heaving. She looked at Beckett. He was bruised. His cheek was bleeding from a scrape, and his clothes were soaked and torn. He looked, she thought, magnificent. And then, for the first time in months, perhaps years, a genuine smile touched Nora Winter's lips. It was a small thing, a slight, exhausted upturn of her mouth, but it lit her face in the darkness. It was the smile of a woman who had been to the edge and had just taken her first step back. Beckett saw it. The sight of it stopped his breath, hitting him with more force than the fall. He stared at her, his own expression grim, his gaze intense. He reached out, not to touch her, but as if to gesture at the smile itself. "Don't laugh too loud," he said, his voice a low, serious rumble, "but keep that smile till morning." The return to Juniper Row was a silent, grueling trek through the coldest hour before dawn. They didn't dare use the main trails, sticking instead to the winding game paths and rocky washes. A route that doubled the distance and tripled the effort. The adrenaline that had fueled their escape from the dam had long since burned away, leaving behind a deep, bone-aching exhaustion. The frost was heavy, coating the sagebrush in a ghostly white, and the air was so still and cold it felt solid, a weight against their lungs. Their clothes, damp with mud and icy water from the dam, clung to them, leaching away what little warmth their bodies produced. When they finally reached the cluster of junipers hiding the sod-roofed bunkhouse, they were moving on sheer nerve. Nora's hands were shaking so badly she couldn't work the latch. Beckett's own fingers were numb, clumsy as blocks of wood. He pushed the door open, his shoulder hitting the jamb, and nearly fell inside. The small room was not as they had left it. A fire was crackling in the cast-iron stove, its orange light a beacon of life in the gloom. The small space was filled with a wonderful, radiating warmth that felt like a physical embrace. On the small table sat a steaming tin pot, 2 mugs, and a plate of thick-cut bread and cheese. A figure rose from the shadows in the corner. It was Maeve Cartwright. "I figured you'd be back," she said, her voice a low rumble. "And I figured you'd be half frozen." "Maeve," Beckett breathed, his voice rough. "How did you get past Deeks? EPH Deeks is a creature of habit. He's watching the main road from the comfort of the livery, with a bottle for company. He'd never think to watch your back door." She moved toward them, her sharp eyes taking in their state: the mud, the torn clothes, the bloody scrape on Beckett's cheek, the exhaustion etched on Nora's face. Maeve clicked her tongue. "You look like you wrestled a badger and lost. Get those wet things off, both of you." She pointed to 2 thick wool blankets folded on the cot. She picked up the tin pot. "This is hot water, honey, and ginger. Get it in you. It'll stop the chill from settling in your bones." Nora was shivering too violently to speak, her teeth chattering. Maeve, all business, unfastened the clasp of Nora's ruined cloak and pulled it from her shoulders. She pushed Nora onto the stool by the fire. "Drink," she ordered, pouring a steaming, fragrant mug and pressing it into Nora's hands. Beckett, moving stiffly, shed his own soaked duster and hung it near the stove, where it immediately began to steam. He poured a mug for himself, the hot tin warming his frozen fingers. The liquid was scalding, sweet and sharp, a jolt of life that burned all the way down. Maeve watched them for a long moment, a look of grim satisfaction on her face. "You found it, didn't you, the dam?" Beckett just nodded, his throat too tight to speak. "And the rumor?" Nora asked, her voice small. "It landed," Maeve said, "like a hawk in a chicken coop. Drover's men are running ragged. The whole town is buzzing. Drover is furious. Pike is nervous. And Ormond—" She smiled thinly. "Ormond is pretending not to be. Your bait worked. Beckett, they'll be meeting tomorrow, just as we hoped. They're walking right into the trap." Maeve picked up the empty pitcher she'd brought. "I'll leave you. The door is barred from the inside. You're safe here tonight. No one will come looking for you in this forgotten little soddy." She paused at the door, her gaze settling on them, a rare softness in her eyes. "You did good, you two. You did a hard, good thing. Now get warm. Get some rest. Tomorrow the real work begins." She slipped out the door, closing it with a quiet click, leaving them alone in the sudden, intimate silence. The room was small, lit only by the flickering light from the stove's grated door. The world had been reduced to this single, warm, safe space for a long time. Neither of them spoke. There was only the sound of the fire hissing and popping, the whisper of the wind outside, and the quiet sipping from their mugs. The warmth and the ginger worked their magic, driving the chill from their limbs, replacing the ache with a heavy, profound weariness. Nora sat on the stool, her hands wrapped around the mug, her gaze lost in the flames. Beckett leaned against the wall nearby, the heat from the stove soaking into his back. The silence wasn't empty. It was filled with everything they had just been through. The chase, the fear, the cold, the intimacy of their hiding place under the rock. "He won't forgive this," Nora said finally, her voice so quiet he almost didn't hear it. "Drover, no, he won't, no." she said, looking up. Her eyes found his in the dim light. Ormond. Franklin Ormond. Drover is a brute. But Ormond, he's a viper. He enjoys the game. He enjoys the cruelty. You know him that well, Beckett asked, pushing away from the wall to sit on the edge of the cot, facing her. She looked down into her mug. When my husband, Thomas, passed, the ranch was in debt, not badly, just a small note at the bank, but the first planting season alone was hard. The pump mechanism broke. I needed money, just a little. To see me through to harvest? She paused, and Beckett could see the shame rising in her, a dark flush on her cheeks. I went to the bank. Judge Pike was there. He said my note was complicated. As a widow, my collateral was uncertain. He turned me down. Orm Rowan, Beckett said, the name a curse. No, Nora said, Franklin Ormond. He was there, in the bank. He overheard. He was so kind, so understanding. He dismissed the judge, said it was uncharitable to treat a grieving widow, so he offered me a private loan from his Eastern associates. He said the terms seemed fair at first, just enough to buy the parts, to hire a hand for the heavy work. She set the mug down, her hands clenching in her lap. I didn't read the fine print. I was a librarian, an archivist. I read paper for a living, and I didn't read my own ruin. The interest rate wasn't just high. It was vicious. It was designed for me to fail. The first payment was small, but the second, it doubled, and the third, it was a loan I could never repay. He trapped me. He's owned me for over a year. Beckett, holding that note over my head, waiting. Waiting for what? For my water rights. He didn't want the land. He wanted the water that ran through it. When I refused to sign them over, he threatened to call in the note, to seize my ranch. And when I still refused, her voice broke. That's when he and Drover invented the scandal. To take it all. The loan was just the hook. The morality clause was the knife. Beckett said nothing. He just watched her, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. The scrape on his cheek was dark red in the firelight. It's my fault, she whispered, the tears she had held back finally welling. I was proud. I was foolish. I signed the paper that gave him the power to destroy me. Beckett was silent for a long time. The stove popped, sending a shower of sparks up its pipe. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, sanded down, as if the words were being dragged from somewhere deep and old. It's not your fault. Nora, it's not your fault you trusted. It's his fault he was a liar. He looked into the fire. My PA, he was a good man, a good rancher. Worked a small spread up on the Sweetwater Fork. He and my ma, they built it from nothing, just sod and sweat. He took a long, slow breath. 10 years ago, a cattle baron from Cheyenne decided he wanted the whole valley. He built a dam, a private dam, illegal as sin, just like Ormond's. His eyes were distant, seeing a past she couldn't. He cut the Sweetwater off, just turned it off, like a spigot. The crops dried up in a week. The cattle started dying. My PA went to the law. The law, a man just like Pike, told him it was a private property dispute, and that the baron had the right. He told my PA to be neighborly. By the end of the summer, Beckett continued, his voice flat. We were ruined. They'd lost everything. My ma, she got sick that winter, a lung fever. She didn't have the strength to fight it. My PA, he just sat on the porch of a ranch he no longer owned, and he watched the snow fall. He was gone 6 months later. He didn't die of a sickness. He died of a broken spirit, of injustice. He looked at Nora, his gaze sharp and clear, pulling her from her own shame. I hate water thieves. Nora, I hate them more than I hate rattlesnakes. A snake strikes to defend itself. These men, they choke you slow. They steal your land, they steal your hope, and they steal your life, all while holding a piece of paper that says they're in the right. What Ormond did to you, it's the same thing. They just found a different kind of dam to build. The confession hung in the air, binding them together. They were not just two people in a room. They were survivors of the same war, fighting the same enemy. The room had grown very warm. The heat from the stove was a heavy, comforting presence. Nora, lost in thought, realized how hot her traveling jacket had become. It was a sturdy, practical garment, but it was stiff, caked with mud, and suddenly felt like an armor she no longer needed. Slowly, almost unconsciously, she began to undo the row of bone buttons down the front. It was just an outer coat, but the act felt significant, heavy with meaning. The firelight licked at the plain wool dress beneath. She undid the last button and let the jacket fall open. "I took it off," she whispered, her voice a reedy thing, full of a new, fragile strength. She was looking at him, her eyes wide and unwavering. "At the dam. I told you. I took off the ring. My past. The woman they tried to make me." She slid the heavy, mud-stained jacket from her shoulders, letting it drop to the floor. It was a shedding of skin. "I took off the fear, the shame, all of it." Her gaze held his, and it was a plea, a challenge, and a statement all in one. "Please," she said, her voice catching, "don't let me put it back on." Beckett went utterly still. He had been reaching for his mug, but his hand stopped, frozen in the air between them. He stared at her, not as a man stares at a woman in a state of undress, for she was fully and modestly clothed, but as a man witnessing something profound. He saw the rawness of her confession, the terrifying vulnerability she was offering him. She wasn't just shedding a coat. She was shedding the last of her defenses. She was handing him her trust, a thing more fragile and more valuable than any land deed. His hand, which had been suspended in the air, slowly changed. His fingers uncurled. He did not move toward her. He did not rush to fill the space. He respected it, honored it. Then, slowly, he reached not for her, but for the woolen blanket on the cot beside him. He stood up, the movement fluid and deliberate. He walked the 2 steps to her stool. She didn't flinch, didn't look away. Her eyes were locked on his, her breathing shallow. He didn't wrap her in the blanket. He lifted it and draped it gently, carefully, over her shoulders, covering her. It was an act of supreme tenderness, an answer to her plea. He was not taking. He was giving, sheltering. His hands rested on the blanket at her shoulders. He could feel the warmth of her through the wool. He didn't move away. He leaned in, and with a gentleness that belied the roughness of his hands, he laid his palm against her forehead, his fingers brushing back the damp strands of hair. It was not a lover's caress. Not yet. It was a benediction, a promise, a way of checking for fever and offering comfort all in one ancient gesture. She closed her eyes at his touch, a long, shuddering sigh escaping her. The tension that had held her rigid for days finally broke, and she sagged, leaning forward. Her forehead came to rest against his chest, right over his heart. He stood there, holding her, his hand still tangled in her hair, the other hand gripping the blanket on her shoulder. They just breathed. The fire crackled. The wind moaned outside the thick sod walls, the chaotic, burning attraction that had sparked between them in the darkness of the alcove, the frantic energy of their escape. All of it softened, clarified, and settled. It was no longer the heat of a chase. It was the warmth of a hearth. A shared, quiet peace. After a long time, he felt her shift. She tilted her head back, looking up at him. Her face was inches from his. He could see the faint freckles across her nose, the exhaustion in her eyes, but also the strength, the steel. He looked down at her, his gaze tracing the line of her mouth. He could feel her breath on his skin. He had fought his own instincts since the moment she'd fallen from her horse. He'd held back at the dam. He was holding back now. He would not be another man who took something from her. He lowered his head, slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. He stopped just an inch from her. "May I?" he asked. His voice was a rasp, a question that held the entire night, the entire fight, in its 2 simple words. Nora's eyes fluttered, then held his. She didn't speak. She just nodded. A single, small, definite movement. He closed the distance, The kiss was not the desperate, frantic collision he had imagined. It was slow. It was deep. It was a promise. It was a statement of fact. His lips were chapped from the cold, but warm, and they moved against hers with a tenderness that was almost painful. It was a kiss of gratitude, of shared survival, of profound, dawning respect. His hand moved from her hair to the back of her neck, his fingers spreading wide, while his other hand instinctively tightened its grip on the edge of the blanket at her shoulder, as if to anchor both of them. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathless. The small, warm room seemed to spin, the firelight dancing in their eyes. Beckett rested his forehead against hers. He felt a sense of rightness, of landing, that he hadn't felt in 10 years. The fight ahead was massive. Drover, Pike, Ormond. They were giants, but he was no longer standing alone. "Tomorrow," he whispered, his voice thick. "We fight. Tonight." He took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of her, of the ginger and the wood smoke. "Tonight. We recover." The Ace of Cinders was the festering heart of Thornbrush Flats after dark. It was a place of cheap whiskey, cigar smoke so thick it clung to you like a shroud, and the constant, nervous clatter of poker chips. It was the last place on earth anyone would look for the quiet widow. Nora Winter, which was precisely why she was there. She was hidden in a narrow, musty storage closet that smelled of stale beer and mice. The closet shared a thin, wood plank wall with the saloon's private back room, the room where Judge Pike conducted his most sensitive business. Maeve, with the leverage of a decade's worth of secrets on the saloon's owner, had arranged for a single board to be loosened. The resulting crack, no wider than a knife blade, gave Nora a near-perfect view of the round table, the pot-bellied stove, and the two men who were deciding the fate of the valley. Nora knelt on a dusty burlap sack, her small notebook open on a crate in front of her, a sharpened pencil held in a steady hand. She was no longer a victim. She was a spy. The archivist in her, the woman who lived and breathed the written word, was wide awake. She transcribed the conversation in a flurry of shorthand, her own system of loops and dashes that was as impenetrable as any code. "The 60-day extension will be more than enough," Judge Horace Pike was saying. He was a portly man, his face flushed with whiskey and self-importance. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "Drover's men have already convinced half the families in the Hollow to sell. A few more weeks of dry wells and quarantine, and the rest will be begging to get out." Franklin Ormond, dapper and composed in his Eastern suit, did not drink. He watched Pike with an air of detached amusement, as if observing a lesser species. He produced a crisp, folded document from his inner coat pocket and slid it across the table. "This should solidify your position. Judge, a federal injunction. Under the Territorial Health and Safety Act. It gives your local quarantine the full weight of the United States government." Pike picked it up, his eyes widening at the impressive eagle seal embossed at the bottom. "My word. Franklin, this is official." "It is," Ormond said with a thin, reptilian smile. "It will make any legal challenges to your authority moot from her hiding place." Nora squinted. She knew that seal. She had seen it on territorial charters. It was a good forgery. The eagle's wings spread just so. But the paper was wrong. It was high-quality linen. But it lacked the faint, telltale watermark of the federal press in Washington. It was an expensive fake, but a fake nonetheless. With this in place, Pike continued, his voice thick with greed. "Drover can complete his acquisitions. He'll consolidate the titles, and then, as agreed, the railroad will purchase the primary water rights for Alderwick Hollow from him. All clean, all legal. The beauty is in the paperwork." "Horace," Ormond said smoothly. Nora's pencil flew across the page. Her ear, trained by years of clerical work, picked up on something else, a detail more damning than the paper or the seal. Ormond's document, which she could see was filled with dense, legalistic text, was supposed to be a federal order, but as Pike read a clause aloud, Nora's mind snagged on the phrasing, and therefore The aforementioned district shall fall under immediate sanitary restriction, and the local authority is empowered to take all necessary actions towards the public good. Nora's mind flashed back to her training in Silver Switch Junction. Federal documents, particularly from the more formal offices in Washington, used the older, British-inflected preposition toward. The addition of these was a regionalism, common in New England and parts of the East Coast where Ormond was from. A clerk in the territorial governor's office would never make that mistake. The forger was not a Westerner. He had betrayed his origins with a single letter. Her focus was broken by a sound from the hallway. A loud, rhythmic thump, scrape, thump, scrape. It was Beckett. He was dressed in a simple work shirt and a leather apron, his face smudged with dirt to complete the picture. He was wrestling a heavy beer keg down the narrow, dimly lit corridor that ran behind the card room. He wasn't delivering it. He was a diversion, an excuse to be in this restricted part of the building. The noise he made was loud enough to be a legitimate disturbance, covering any smaller sounds he might make. Tucked deep in the apron's pocket, wrapped in an oilcloth, was a heavy brass object, the true official seal of Thornbrush County, which Maeve had held in her safe for years, a relic from a time when the county clerk was an honest man who had trusted her more than the bank. Beckett's plan was audacious. He and Nora had spent the afternoon with the county ledgers, creating a document of their own. It was a fraudulent appendix to water operations for Bristlecone Wash, filled with technical data they had copied, but containing one crucial, fabricated detail, a line item, supposedly from 6 months prior, authorizing a preliminary survey for a new diversion, a survey signed by Judge Pike. Their goal was to swap this appendix with a real, innocuous page in the stack of papers on Pike's desk, a stack that contained the official land transfer agreements. If they could get Pike to stamp and sign the entire stack at the end of the night without rereading every page, his signature would retroactively authorize a survey for a dam that didn't exist yet, proving his foreknowledge and complicity. As Beckett drew level with the storage closet, he deliberately let the keg slip. It hit the floor with a deafening boom that shook the entire hallway. Inside the room, Pike jumped, spilling his whiskey. What in blazes was that? Ormond looked annoyed. Just the help, incompetent as always. The door to the back room opened. Sorry for the disturbance. Judge, a harried-looking bartender said, sticking his head in. New delivery. This was Beckett's chance. With the door open and the men distracted, he righted the keg and continued his noisy journey down the hall, past the back room and toward the far storage area where the real document switch needed to happen. He had only a minute, but nothing was ever that simple. Just as the bartender was closing the door, another one burst open further down the hall. Deputy E.P.H. Deeks strode into the saloon's main room, his eyes sweeping the crowd. He was on edge, his hand resting on his gun. Maeve's rumor had made him paranoid. He was hunting for trouble. From her stool at the far end of the bar, Maeve saw him. She didn't hesitate. She slammed her hand down on the felt of a nearby poker table. "You cheating son of a mule," she roared, pointing a finger at a stunned-looking card dealer. "I saw you palm that ace. The dealer, a weedy man named Slim." Turned pale. "Ma'am, I swear I didn't." "Don't you lie to me." Maeve's voice cut through the saloon like a whip. "You've been dealing from the bottom all night." The entire card room went silent, then erupted. Men jumped to their feet, some yelling at the dealer, others defending him. It was instant, beautiful chaos. Deeks, his instincts taking over, immediately abandoned his search and shoved his way through the crowd toward the escalating argument. Maeve had just bought them their window, back in the closet. Nora knew it was time. She had to plant her own piece of evidence. She eased the door open a crack. The hallway was empty. Beckett was at the far end, presumably making the switch. The shouts from the saloon covered any sound she might make. She slipped out, a small, folded piece of paper in her hand. She moved quickly to the door of the back room, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knelt, her fingers finding the small gap at the bottom of the door. She was about to slide the paper underneath when her foot, tangled in her skirt, slipped on a slick of spilled beer on the floorboards. She didn't fall, but she stumbled, her shoulder bumping hard against the door. It swung inward a few inches with a soft creak. For a single, horrifying second, time stopped. Franklin Ormond, who had turned to look toward the commotion in the main room, glanced back. His eyes, cold and intelligent, met hers through the gap. He didn't see her clearly. He saw a shape, a shadow, the briefest impression of a woman's form, of wide, terrified eyes in a pale face, before she scrambled back, pulling the door shut. It was a flicker, a ghost, but Nora knew he had seen her. She saw the flash of confusion in his eyes, followed by a dawning, predatory suspicion. She flattened herself back inside the closet, her mind screaming. It was over. He had seen her, but Beckett was already moving. He had made the switch. The fake appendix was in place. He was rolling the keg back down the hall when he saw the door swing open. Saw Nora's stumble. Saw Ormond's head turn. He didn't break stride. He abandoned the keg, letting it roll to a stop, and stepped into the open doorway of the back room just as Ormond was rising from his chair. "My apologies, Mr. Ormond." "Judge," Beckett said, his voice full of a rustic, deferential respect. He dipped his head, a rancher addressing his betters. "The floor out here is slicker than a greased pig. Hope my clumsiness didn't disturb you." Ormond stared at him, his gaze sharp, his mind clearly working. He looked from Beckett to the now closed door where he'd seen the shadow. There was someone else. Ormond said, his voice a low, dangerous purr. "A woman." Beckett feigned a look of slow-witted confusion. "A woman? Sir, no, sir. Just me in this here barrel. Been a long night, I reckon." He took a step further into the room, deliberately placing himself in Ormond's line of sight, blocking the view of the hallway. He gestured toward the half-empty whiskey bottle on the table. "Looks like you've been having a long night yourselves, gentlemen," he said with a knowing, conspiratorial grin. The kind a servant might give his master. He looked directly at Ormond, his eyes holding a hint of feigned concern. "You're looking a little unsteady on your feet, sir. Perhaps you've had a bit too much of the good stuff. Seeing things in the shadows." It was a masterful stroke. He was using Ormond's own arrogance, his sense of superiority, against him. To admit he'd seen a woman now would be to admit this simple ranch hand might be right, that he, the great Franklin Ormond, was drunk and seeing things. It was a small, public humiliation he would never allow. Ormond's eyes narrowed. He looked at Beckett, at the whiskey bottle, and back at Beckett. A flicker of doubt crossed his face. He couldn't be sure of what he'd seen. To cause a scene now would be undignified. "Perhaps you're right," Ormond said, his voice cold as ice. He sat back down, though his eyes never left Beckett. "See that you clean up your mess?" "Yes, sir," Beckett said, backing out of the room and pulling the door firmly closed. He leaned against the wall in the hallway, his heart pounding. It had been too close. In the closet, Nora was shaking. She had failed. She hadn't planted her evidence. But as she leaned back against the wall, her hand brushed against the pocket of the heavy man's coat Maeve had given her to wear as a disguise. She felt the folded paper inside, and she remembered there was another way. She took a calming breath. The shouts from the saloon were dying down as Maeve, her work done, allowed herself to be pacified by the dealer. Deeks was still occupied. Pike and Ormond were still in the room. She slipped out of the closet one last time. She didn't go to the back room door. She crept down the hall to the small, grimy window at the very end, a window that looked out onto the dark, refuse-strewn alley. This was her last chance. She pulled the folded paper from her pocket. It was a simple warehouse storage receipt from the freight office, dated 3 weeks prior. It documented the purchase, by a man in the employ of Ormond Rail Freight, of 3 tins of red letter brand pigment dye. It was a common dye, used for painting signs or marking lumber. But Nora knew, from her time as an archivist, that it was also the exact shade of crimson used in the official ink pad for the Thornbrush County seal, the seal Ormond and Pike were using to stamp their fraudulent land transfers right now. In that room, The seal they had likely stained with this very dye to make their forgeries look authentic. She had to get the receipt into that room, onto Ormond's person if possible. She saw him through the back room window. He was standing now, putting on his overcoat, preparing to leave. His coat was draped over the back of his chair. Nora took the small, heavy rock she had placed in her pocket earlier. She wrapped the receipt tightly around it. She opened the hallway window, the screech of the wood barely audible over the noise from the saloon. She had one shot. With a flick of her wrist, she tossed the small bundle. It flew in a perfect, low arc, sailing through the open window of the back room. It didn't make a sound. It landed perfectly, silently, in the deep outer pocket of Franklin Ormond's own overcoat. Nora didn't wait to see if they noticed. She pulled the hallway windows shut and melted back into the shadows, making her way toward the kitchen and the alley exit. The evidence was planted. The trap was set. But as she slipped out into the cold night air, the image of Ormond's eyes, suspicious and cold, was burned into her mind. She had won the battle, but she had a terrifying feeling that she'd just made a very powerful, very personal enemy. Dawn broke not with a blaze of glory, but with a slow, reluctant surrender. A pale silver light seeped over the eastern peaks of the Silver Gate Pass, illuminating a world of stark, brutal beauty. They rode through a cathedral of gray rock and swirling mist, their horses' hooves muffled by the damp ground. The air was thin and sharp, tasting of pine and cold stone. Every jagged peak, every twisted juniper clinging to a cliff face, seemed to hold its breath in the morning stillness. They rode close together, a small, two-person island of warmth and resolve in the vast, indifferent landscape. They reached the Dry Lantern Station an hour after sunrise. It was little more than a one-room shack, perched precariously on a ledge overlooking the headwaters of Bristlecone Wash. It was a lonely, forgotten place, built 20 years ago by the Territorial Survey and visited only a few times a year to check the water gauges, or so it should have been. Beckett dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft earth. Something's wrong. The brass padlock on the heavy plank door was new. It gleamed in the morning light, a fresh, ugly scar on the weathered wood. Their enemies had not just falsified the records, they had sealed the evidence away. "They've locked us out," Beckett said, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. He could shoot the lock, but the sound would carry for miles. Nora slid from her horse, her eyes fixed on the lock. Perhaps not. She reached up and pulled a single, sturdy pin from the intricate knot of her hair. She knelt before the door, the hairpin held delicately in her fingers. "My father was a locksmith before he was a farmer," she said, her voice quiet. "He taught me that most locks are more honest than the men who use them. They only have one secret to tell." Beckett watched, amazed, as she slid the first end of the pin into the keyhole, using it as a tension wrench. With the other, straightened end, she began to probe, her head cocked, listening. The only sound was the faint, metallic scrape of steel on brass, a sound as delicate as a spider spinning a web. It seemed an impossible task, a fragile hope against a solid, unyielding obstacle. Minutes stretched. A bead of sweat trickled down her temple. Then, a sound, a tiny, almost inaudible click, followed by another, and then a solid, satisfying thunk as the shackle popped open. Nora sat back on her heels, a small, triumphant smile on her lips. She held up the open padlock. Beckett just shook his head, a look of profound respect in his eyes. The inside of the station was cold and smelled of dust and old paper. A single beam of light from the dirty window cut through the gloom, illuminating dancing motes of dust. The logbooks were where they should be, stacked on a rough-hewn shelf. But as Beckett opened the most recent volume, his heart sank. The pages hadn't just been altered, they had been savaged. The original ink had been meticulously scraped away with a sharp blade, leaving behind a rough, scarred patch of paper where a new, lower water level had been written in. It was a crude but effective forgery. "We can't prove a thing," Beckett said, his voice flat. "They've destroyed the original data." "No," Nora said. running her fingers lightly over the damaged page. "They've only hidden it. The ink they used back then was heavy, made with oak galls and iron. When you write with it, it doesn't just sit on the surface. It soaks into the fibers of the paper. You can scrape the top layer off, but the ghost remains." Beckett looked at her. "Can you read a ghost know?" she said. "But maybe. We can make it speak." Beckett understood. He went to the small, pot-bellied stove in the corner. It was cold, but the wood box beside it was half full. He broke a piece of charcoal from a charred log and crushed it into a fine, black powder on a tin plate. From his saddlebag, he produced his flask of whiskey. He handed the plate and the flask to Nora. "An old prospector showed me this once. Said you can find the truth in almost anything if you know how to look." Nora took a clean sheet of paper from a different, untouched ledger. She laid it over the scraped section of the page. She poured a small amount of whiskey onto a corner of her handkerchief, creating a damp, alcohol-soaked pad. Then, with her other hand, she took a pinch of the charcoal dust and sprinkled it evenly over the clean sheet. "Now," she whispered, more to herself than to him. She began to dab the whiskey-soaked cloth onto the back of the ledger page, directly behind the scraped section. The alcohol vapor soaked through the old paper, carrying with it the faintest, most microscopic traces of the original iron gall ink. These invisible traces rose and were pressed against the new sheet of paper, where they were caught and held by the fine, black charcoal dust, slowly, like a photograph developing in a dark room. An image began to appear on the fresh page. It was faint, ghostly, and in perfect reverse, but it was there. The spidery script of the old station master, and the numbers he had written. The original reading 4.2 feet, the forgery 1.8 feet. "There it is," Beckett breathed. The lie. They worked for an hour, revealing the ghosts on a dozen different pages. The story they told was undeniable. There had been no drought. The water levels for the past year had been consistent, healthy. The entire crisis had been manufactured. They had their proof, the final, unarguable piece of evidence that would hang Ormond and Pike. The gunshot was so loud, so sudden, it felt like the sky had cracked open. The window of the station exploded inward, spraying glass and splinters across the room. A bullet thudded into the log wall, exactly where Beckett's head had been a second before. They were in a trap. "Get down," Beckett roared, shoving Nora toward the floor. He drew his Colt, his mind racing. They hadn't been followed. This was an ambush. Drover's men had been waiting for them. Another shot ripped through the thin plank door. Then another. They were being fired on from both sides, from the rocks above and the tree line below. "They've got us pinned!" Beckett yelled over the roar of another shot. "We have to get out of here. The station was a death trap." He scanned the small room. There was no back exit, only the one door and the shattered window. But there was a trap door in the floor, leading to a small storage cellar, and from there, a low, narrow tunnel, barely large enough for a man to crawl through. That exited on the steep cliff face behind the station. It was used to get to the external water gauge. "The cellar," he shouted, pointing. He kicked the trap door open. A black, musty square opened in the floor. Below, a rickety wooden ladder descended into darkness. "Go, Nora, go." He laid down covering fire, firing 2 quick shots through the window, forcing the riflemen in the rocks to duck for cover. Nora didn't hesitate. She swung herself onto the ladder and disappeared into the darkness below. Beckett was about to follow when a shadow fell across the doorway. One of Drover's men, a big bearded man with a shotgun, filled the frame. He was grinning, a predator who had his quarry cornered. There was no time to aim. Beckett threw himself sideways, out of the line of fire, just as the shotgun boomed, its blast tearing a huge, splintered hole in the wall behind him. He landed hard, his shoulder hitting the floor. The gunman charged into the room. Beckett didn't try to get up. He shoved with his legs, sliding across the dusty floorboards. He slammed into the gunman's knees, sending the big man staggering off balance. As the man stumbled, Beckett swung his legs up and kicked the shotgun from his hands. It clattered into a corner. The man roared in anger and lunged, but Beckett was already moving. He scrambled backward, toward the open trapdoor. He swung his legs over the edge and slid down the ladder, his boots finding the rungs just as the gunman reached the opening. He didn't have time to get to the bottom. He let go, dropping the last 10 feet and landing in a crouch on the damp earth of the cellar floor. Above, the gunman's boots appeared on the ladder. Suddenly, from outside, there was a strange, hissing sound, followed by a series of choked, violent coughs. Nora. When she had exited the tunnel onto the narrow cliffside ledge, she found herself just below the sniper's nest in the rocks. The gunman was focused on the front of the station, his back to her. Near his position was the smoldering remains of a small campfire the ambushers had used to keep warm during their long wait. And next to it, a small canvas sack. She recognized it instantly. It was a bag of slaked lime, used for marking trails or chinking walls. On its own, it was harmless. But thrown into a fire, without a second thought, Nora had grabbed the bag, ripped it open, and flung the entire contents into the heart of the glowing embers. The result was instantaneous. The fine white powder erupted in a thick, choking cloud of acrid smoke. The gunman, caught completely off guard, inhaled a lungful of the caustic fumes. He dropped his rifle, clutching at his throat, his eyes streaming, temporarily blinded and unable to breathe. The distraction was all Beckett needed. As the gunman on the ladder paused, confused by the commotion, Beckett lunged upward. He grabbed the man's ankle and pulled hard. The man yelled, his grip on the ladder breaking. He came crashing down, a dead weight of flailing limbs, landing in a heap on the cellar floor with a sickening crunch. He didn't move. Beckett didn't wait to check on him. He scrambled over the unconscious man and into the tunnel, pulling Nora in after him just as more of Drover's men came running. They were on a narrow, exposed ledge, with a sheer drop below and their enemies above. They were trapped. This way, Beckett yelled. There was no way back. The only way was forward, toward the dam. It was a desperate, insane idea, born of pure necessity. He pulled a small, heavy, oilskin-wrapped package from his saddlebag, which he had grabbed before entering the station. Inside were 4 sticks of mining dynamite and a length of fuse, a gift from a prospector friend who owed him a favor, brought along for just this kind of emergency. They ran, scrambling along the cliff face, using a series of narrow game trails. Bullets whined around them, kicking up dust and stone. They reached the back of the illegal dam, the massive earthen wall that was holding back the valley's lifeblood. "We can't destroy it," Nora yelled over the gunfire. "It'll flood the whole canyon." "We're not going to destroy it," Beckett shouted back, his eyes scanning the structure. "We're going to expose it." He pointed to the massive iron anchor pins that were driven deep into the rock, securing the main timber supports. "We break the seal. Just a crack, enough to make the dam fail slowly, enough to create a leak they can't hide." Working under fire, their hands shaking with adrenaline, they packed the dynamite around the base of the largest anchor pin. Nora, her fingers surprisingly nimble, held the sticks in place while Beckett used his belt to bind them tight against the rock. He threaded the fuse, leaving a 6-inch tail. "Get ready to run," he yelled. He pulled a match from a waterproof tin, struck it on the rock, and touched the flame to the end of the fuse. It sputtered, caught, and began to hiss. A tiny, burning snake eating its way toward oblivion. "Go!" They didn't run. They dove, throwing themselves off the edge of the dam's retaining wall and sliding down the steep, muddy embankment. They landed in the icy water of the nearly dry wash below just as the world erupted. It wasn't a loud explosion, but a deep, gut-wrenching thump that seemed to shake the very foundations of the canyon. A geyser of mud, water, and splintered wood shot 50 feet into the air. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of tortured timber, a crack appeared in the face of the dam. A small trickle of water became a steady stream. Then a powerful, roaring jet. They had done it. The victory was short-lived. The explosion sent a shower of rocks and debris raining down from the cliff face. Beckett, seeing the danger, reacted without thinking. He threw his body over Nora's, pushing her down into the mud, shielding her with his own back as stones and splinters rained down around them. He felt a sharp, searing pain as a rock struck his shoulder, but he held his position until the last pebble had fallen. Slowly, he pushed himself up. They were both soaked, covered head to toe in freezing mud, and breathing in ragged gasps. He looked at Nora. Her face was streaked with dirt. Her hair was a mess, but her eyes were shining with a wild, fierce light. He looked up at the dam. Water was pouring through the breach, a silver torrent of truth that could no longer be denied. They had survived, and they had their proof. A laugh escaped his lips. It wasn't a sound of humor, but of pure, unadulterated relief. It was the sound of a man who had faced death and won. Nora looked at him, then at the gushing water, and she began to laugh too. They knelt there in the mud and the water, under the watchful eyes of the enraged and defeated men on the cliffs above, and they laughed. Two drenched, triumphant survivors in the heart of a canyon that was, finally, coming back to life. The ghost town of Painted Sable was a graveyard of ambition. It consisted of a handful of sun-bleached, derelict buildings huddled against a bleak mesa, a failed trading post that had died when the rumored stagecoach route went north. It was the perfect place to disappear. The seed shed they'd broken into was the most intact structure, its roof mostly whole, its walls tight. It smelled of dry earth, burlap, and the faint, dusty spice of spilled millet and forgotten herbs. Outside, the temperature had plummeted, and the vast, empty silence of the high desert pressed in on them. Inside was a small, fragile bubble of warmth. Beckett had built a tiny, smokeless fire in a rusted, overturned iron basin he'd found, feeding it with dry slats of wood pulled from a broken crate. The light was minimal, a flickering orange glow that barely reached the corners of the shed. Leaving the rafters in deep shadow, they sat on stacked burlap sacks, close to the makeshift hearth. The immediate danger from the ambush was past, but the tension remained. A low thrum beneath the silence. They were fugitives, their enemies routed but not defeated. Tomorrow, they would ride to Thornbrush Flats. Tomorrow, they would face Pike and Ormond. But tomorrow was a lifetime away. Tonight, there was only this small, warm space. Nora had unpinned her hair and was drying it by the fire. She had washed the mud from it in a near-frozen creek miles back, and now the damp, dark strands hung over her shoulders. She combed through them with her fingers, the firelight catching the reddish highlights, turning her into a figure from a Dutch painting. The simple, domestic act was so profoundly normal, so at odds with the chaos of the past 2 days, that Beckett found himself watching her, mesmerized. He was tending to her jacket. The sleeve had been torn on the rocks during their escape, with a needle and thick thread from his saddlebag's repair kit. He was stitching the rent with slow, deliberate movements. His hands, calloused and scarred from rope and iron, looked oversized and clumsy holding the tiny needle. Yet his stitches were surprisingly neat, strong, and even. He was a man who knew how to mend what was broken. Nora watched him work, his head bent, the firelight casting strong shadows across the harsh planes of his face. He was scraped and bruised, his shirt torn, but he moved with an economy of motion, a deep-seated competence that she found herself clinging to. The scrape on his cheek from their fall was raw, but it was another, older mark that caught her eye. A thin, white scar ran from just below his ear down to his collar, disappearing beneath the fabric of his shirt. It was not a scar from a blade. It was puckered, old, a mark of something that had burned. She stopped combing her hair. Her hand, still damp, moved with a will of its own. She leaned forward, her fingers light as a moth's wing, and traced the pale line on his neck. He flinched at the first touch, a barely perceptible tightening of his muscles, but he didn't pull away. He simply stopped sewing and held very still. "Were you afraid?" she asked. Her voice was a whisper, lost in the crackle of the fire. He didn't pretend to misunderstand. He knew she wasn't just asking about the scar. She was asking about the dam, the ambush, the rifles. He turned his head slowly, meeting her gaze. His eyes were dark, reflective in the firelight. "Yes," he said. The admission was stark. stripped of any bravado. I was, when that window shattered, when I saw them on the ridge. I was. He looked down at the jacket in his hands, then back at her. His voice dropped, becoming rougher, thicker. But that's not what I was thinking about. Not really. He paused, as if testing the weight of the words before speaking them. I'm more afraid of losing you. Nora. The words landed in the small space between them, as real and solid as the iron basin. It wasn't a poetic declaration. It was a statement of fact, a confession torn from him by the day's violence. He was a man who had lived alone, who had buried his past and expected no future. He had been afraid of dying, but he had just realized, with the force of a physical blow, that he was terrified of returning to the emptiness he had known before. He was terrified of her being taken from him. Nora's breath caught. She had expected denial or a gruff reassurance. She had not expected this raw, unguarded truth. She saw in his eyes that he was just as surprised by the revelation as she was. Her hand was still on his neck. She didn't move it. She felt the pulse beating steadily beneath his skin, a rhythm of life that was suddenly, inextricably, tied to her own. All her life, she had been defined by others. She was a daughter, a librarian, a wife, a widow. She was the woman in the land deed, the woman in the loan agreement, the woman in Drover's fabricated scandal. Beckett wasn't looking at any of them. He was looking at her. Slowly, deliberately. Her other hand rose to her throat. She touched the thin, velvet ribbon she wore tied around her neck. It was a habit, a small, proper adornment she had worn for years. It was the last piece of the old Nora, the last symbol of a life defined by modesty, constraint, and the quiet acceptance of her role. It was the final remnant of the widow Mrs. Winter, with a deft, practiced motion. She untied the small knot. The velvet slid from her skin. She held it in her palm for a moment, a thin, dark line, and then she held it out to him. I took off the ring to free myself from the past they built for me, she whispered, her voice shaking slightly. This is the last piece of the woman who was afraid to fight. She pressed the ribbon into his large, calloused hand. Beckett stopped breathing. He looked down at the small, insignificant piece of velvet in his palm. He understood. This was not a token. It was a surrender. It was the final key. She was giving him the last of her old life, trusting him with the rawness of her new one. His fingers closed around it, his hand engulfing it completely. He felt the soft texture against his rough skin, and a fierce, protective instinct, sharper than any fear he had ever known, rose in him. He put the mended jacket aside. He didn't take the ribbon. He kept his fist closed around it, as if holding a solemn oath. The cold from the walls was pressing in. The small fire was not enough to heat the entire shed. Without a word, he reached for the heavy wool blanket from his bedroll, the one they had shared in the soddy, and shook it open. He didn't ask. He simply wrapped it around her shoulders, and then, in the same motion, wrapped it around his own, pulling them together. They sat side by side, huddled under the same wool, sharing the same small pocket of warmth. They were knee to shoulder, hip to hip. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was charged, electric. It was the silence of two people who had said everything without saying anything at all. He could feel the warmth of her body, the dampness of her hair against his shoulder. He could smell the clean, womanly scent of her, mixed with wood smoke. He turned his head. She was already looking at him. Her face was very close, her lips slightly parted, her eyes wide and dark and trusting. The "may I" he had asked in the bunkhouse had been a question. This was no longer a question. It was an answer. He leaned in, and she met him halfway. The kiss was nothing like the first one. That had been a discovery, a moment of gentle confirmation. This was a claiming. It was a long, slow, deep kiss, born of shared danger and profound relief. It was the kiss of two people who had seen the end of their lives and had chosen to walk back together. There was no desperation in it, but a deep, abiding certainty. It was a silent vow, a promise of mourning, a seal on the truth they both now knew. His hand came up to cup her jaw, his thumb tracing the line of her cheek, and her hand rested on his chest, right over his heart, feeling the steady, powerful beat beneath her palm. The fire popped and hissed, a lonely counterpoint to the quiet intensity of the moment. There was no world outside this blanket, outside this small, warm circle of light, from outside the small, grimy window. The world offered a quiet benediction. The first delicate flakes of snow began to fall, drifting down from a sky that had turned a flat, heavy gray. They landed silently, dusting the dead grass and the abandoned wagons of painted sable in a shroud of white. When Beckett finally drew back, they rested their foreheads together. They were both breathless, their breath mingling in the cold air. "Tomorrow," he whispered, his voice a low, rough thing against her skin. "We show them the truth." The shed was silent, steeped in a perfect, fragile peace. The snow fell, thicker now, muffling the world. And then, a sound. A sharp, sudden creak, followed by the distinct, grinding crunch of a heavy wagon wheel on the new, thin layer of snow. It was not a friendly sound. It was the sound of pursuit, of malice. It was a sound that did not belong in this peaceful, frozen graveyard. Beckfett and Nora froze, their embrace tightening. The sanctuary was breached. The night was not over. Deeks, or someone worse. They had been found. The Thornbrush Flats Town Hall was not a courtroom. It was a stage for a pre-written play. The air was thick with the smell of old pine, dust, and the nervous sweat of the men who packed the rough-hewn benches. Sunlight, thick with dancing dust motes, slanted through the tall, grimy windows, illuminating the grim faces of the ranchers and farmers who had been summoned to witness the final, legal strangulation of Alderwick Hollow. Judge Horace Pike sat enthroned behind a massive oak desk on a raised platform, a position that added a foot of fraudulent authority to his 5.5 feet of bluster. To his right, Franklin Ormond stood, calm and impeccable in his tailored suit, a leather portfolio tucked under his arm. In the front row of benches, Silas Drover sat with his arms crossed over his barrel chest, a faint, predatory smirk on his lips. And guarding the only entrance, his hand resting casually on his holstered pistol, was Deputy E.P.H. Deeks. The trap was set. The wolves were in charge of the henhouse. "This proceeding is hereby called to order." Pike boomed, his voice echoing slightly in the tense silence. "We are convened to hear the final petition for the indefinite extension of the sanitary quarantine of the area known as Alderwick Hollow, due to the ongoing and severe outbreak of dysentery." A low murmur of dissent rippled through the assembled ranchers, but it was quickly silenced by a hard glare from Deeks. "Mr. Ormond," Pike said, gesturing magnanimously, "if you would present the federal corroboration." Ormond stepped forward, his movement smooth and confident. "Thank you, Your Honor." He opened his portfolio and produced the forged document, its impressive eagle seal catching the light. "As you know, the health and safety of this territory is a matter of federal concern. This document, an injunction from the Territorial Marshal's Office, under the authority of the Federal Health and Safety Act, grants this court full and unquestionable power to maintain the quarantine for as long as it deems necessary to protect the public good." He handed the document to Pike, who held it up for the crowd to see, the seal gleaming like a promise of their doom. Silas Drover's smirk widened. It was over. The law, backed by the full power of the United States government, was on their side. "Does anyone," Pike asked, his voice dripping with false sincerity, "have just cause to show why this measure should not be made permanent?" The heavy main door of the hall swung open with a loud groan, breaking the spell. Maeve Cartwright stood in the doorway. She was not alone. Behind her stood a dozen men and women from the surrounding homesteads, their faces grim, their eyes hard. They were the ones whose wells were also starting to run dry, the ones who had listened to Maeve's whispers and Beckett's warnings. "We have cause, Judge," Maeve said, her voice clear and strong as she ushered the farmers into the room. They filed in, standing along the back wall. A silent, powerful jury. These are the folks from down canyon. Their wells are fed by the same water as the hollow. Their water is low, but their families are healthy. You say there's a plague in Alderwick Hollow. I ask you, Judge, where are the sick? Pike sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. This is highly irregular. These people have no standing here. They have the standing of neighbors, a new voice said. All heads turned. Beckett Vale and Nora Winter walked through the door Maeve had opened. They were not bedraggled fugitives. They were clean, their clothes were mended, and they moved with a quiet, focused intensity that immediately shifted the balance of power in the room. Deeks took a step to block them, but Beckett met his gaze with a look so cold and hard that the deputy hesitated. They walked past him and stopped before the judge's bench. This court is hearing testimony regarding a public health crisis, Nora said, her voice shaking only slightly. The archivist finding her footing on this new, dangerous stage. We have evidence pertaining to that crisis. Ormond laughed. A short, condescending bark. What evidence could you possibly have? Mrs. Winter slander hearsay. Nora ignored him. She placed the restored pages from the Dry Lantern Station logbook on the edge of Pike's desk. This is the official record of water flow in Bristlecone Wash for the past year. The original data. Restored. As you can see, the water levels have been consistent. There has been no drought. A louder murmur rose from the crowd. Men leaned forward, craning their necks to see the faint, ghostly script on the pages. Pike stared at the papers as if they were snakes. And if there is no drought, Beckett said, his voice a low rumble, then one must ask why the wells are dry. He unrolled a large sheet of canvas on the floor in front of the bench. On it, drawn in charcoal with stark, angry lines, was a detailed map of the illegal dam. In the corner, Nora had perfectly replicated the stenciled brand. This is why. An illegal dam, built on federal land, bearing the mark of Ormond rail freight. The room erupted. The sight of the map, the undeniable brand, was a spark in a powder keg. Men who had been suspicious were now certain. They had been robbed. Ormond's composure finally cracked. This is an outrage. A fabrication. These are the desperate lies of a wanted fugitive and a disgraced woman. They have no proof, don't we? Nora's voice cut through the noise like a shard of glass. She looked directly at Ormond, her fear gone, replaced by a cold, righteous fury. A brand on a dam requires paint. A forged seal on a federal document requires a specific color of ink, a color that must be purchased. She took a small, folded piece of paper from her pocket and held it up. The warehouse receipt. This is a receipt from the freight office, dated 3 weeks ago, for the purchase of 3 tins of red letter brand pigment dye, the exact dye needed to stain a county seal to mimic the color of federal ink, purchased by your employee, Mr. Ormond. On the same day the first quarantine notices were posted. She had not been able to plant it on him, but revealing it now, in public, was even more devastating. It was a direct, undeniable link between him and the forgeries. Ormond went pale. His eyes, for a split second, darted to the pocket of the overcoat he had worn the night before. A reflexive, guilty gesture that did not go unnoticed by the woman standing at the back of the room. Deeks saw his employer falter. He saw his authority crumbling. He acted. That's enough, he bellowed, striding forward. Nora Winter, you're under arrest for slander, resisting arrest, and public nuisance. He reached for Nora's arm. Beckett moved, not with violence, but with a chilling, deliberate calm. He stepped between Nora and the deputy, blocking Deeks's path, from his own belt. He unhooked a pair of handcuffs he had taken from the unconscious gunman at the station. He held them out to the deputy. Try them on, Beckett said, his voice dangerously quiet. Deeks froze, his hand hovering in midair. The entire room held its breath. The confrontation was no longer about paper. It was about to become about blood. That will not be necessary. Deputy. The voice was female, crisp, and carried an authority that silenced the room more effectively than any gavel. It came from the doorway. A woman stood there, silhouetted against the bright morning light. She was tall, dressed in a practical traveling suit, her face framed by iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. She was not beautiful, but her face was intelligent, her eyes sharp and missing nothing. She radiated an aura of incorruptible, weary competence. "My name is Miriam Locke," she said, stepping into the room. "Territorial Inspector. I received an anonymous telegram concerning irregularities in Thornbrush Flats." She held up the telegram. Maeve, from the back of the room, gave a nearly imperceptible nod. Inspector Locke's gaze swept the room, taking in every detail: Pike's terrified face, Ormond's frozen panic, Drover's crumbling smirk, and the tense standoff in the center of the floor. "It seems I've arrived just in time," she said dryly. She walked to the center of the room, her boots making a steady, implacable sound on the floorboards. "Deputy Deeks, you will return to your post at the door and you will let no one leave. This hall is now sealed under the authority of the Territorial Governor's office." Deeks, outranked and utterly bewildered, could only stammer, "Yes, ma'am," and retreat to the door. Locke turned her attention to the judge's bench. "Judge Pike, I will need to see your official county seal, the one used to validate land transfers." Pike looked like a cornered animal. It's in my safe. I don't see the relevance." "I will be the judge of its relevance," Locke said, her voice hardening. "Open the safe." Shaking, Pike fumbled with the combination of the heavy iron safe behind his desk. The room was so quiet that the click of the tumblers sounded like hammer blows. He swung the heavy door open. Locke walked behind the desk. She reached into the safe and produced the heavy, brass county seal. She held it up to the light. There, clinging to the deep grooves of the embossed letters, were unmistakable, damning flecks of crimson, the same shade as the eagle on Ormond's forgery. "It appears," Locke said, her voice ringing with cold irony, "that your seal has been bleeding. It was over." Pike collapsed into his chair. A deflated balloon of a man, Ormond, his face a mask of fury, took a single, calculated step back, his eyes already seeking the rear exit. Silas Drover, for the first time, looked truly worried. He gave a subtle, almost invisible signal to his men scattered in the crowd, a slight dip of his head. It was a signal to withdraw, to cut their losses. The tension in the room broke. The ranchers and farmers, seeing their victory, began to shout, a rising tide of anger and relief. In the midst of the chaos, Nora took a step forward. She held up her right hand. It was bare. Then, from her pocket, she produced the simple, scratched gold wedding band. "Judge Pike," she called out, her voice rising above the din, clear and ringing with a strength she never knew she possessed. "You and Mr. Drover and Mr. Ormond, you tried to use this ring to condemn me. You tried to use my loyalty to my husband's memory as a weapon to make me powerless." She held the ring high for all to see. "I took this ring off," she declared, her voice resonating with the power of a final, unassailable truth. "I took it off so that no one could ever again use a false law to bind me. I took it off to claim my own name." A roar of approval went up from the crowd. It wasn't just about water anymore. It was about justice. It was about a woman who had refused to be broken, who had stood up to the powerful and, against all odds, had won. The farmers, the ranchers, Maeve, they were all cheering. Their voices joined in a single, triumphant shout of liberation. Chaos is a ladder, and in the pandemonium of the town hall, Franklin Ormond and Silas Drover saw their only way down. As the ranchers roared their approval for Nora, Drover moved. He wasn't a man for legal maneuvering. He was a creature of brute force. He overturned the heavy defense table with a single, furious shove, sending law books and inkwells crashing to the floor. The act was a sudden, violent punctuation mark that shocked the room into a momentary silence. In that half-second of stunned inaction, Ormond was already at the rear door, a small, silver-plated derringer in his hand. Deeks, seeing his master's intent, drew his own pistol, not to arrest them, but to cover their retreat. "Stay back," he snarled at the crowd. waving his gun wildly. "All of you, stay back." It was all they needed. Drover and Ormond slipped through the back door and into the alley. "Stop them," Inspector Locke commanded. But her two deputies were blocked by the overturned table and Deeks's waving pistol. Beckett didn't hesitate. He vaulted over the judge's bench, landing lightly on the other side, his path to the back door clear. Nora was right behind him. "They're going for the dam," she cried, her mind instantly grasping their desperate, final gambit. "They're going to destroy the evidence. My horse is at the livery," Beckett shouted to Locke. "Get your men." By the time they burst into the alley, Ormond and Drover were already mounted. Spurring their horses into a gallop, they thundered out of town, kicking up a storm of mud and refuse. Their goal clear a straight, desperate line toward the high country. The chase was a raw, primal thing. A desperate race across the sun-scorched expanse of the Coyote Needle Flats. The sky was a vast, unforgiving blue, the air shimmering with heat. Dust, churned up by the pounding hooves, was a constant, choking presence, a red cloud that trailed the riders like a bloody banner. Beckett pushed his powerful buckskin to its limit, riding low over the animal's neck. Nora was beside him, her face set in a mask of grim determination. Her earlier fear burned away and replaced with a hard, cold resolve. A few lengths behind them rode Inspector Locke and her two deputies, their faces stern, the law in grim pursuit of its own corruption. Ahead, Drover and Ormond rode with the recklessness of cornered animals. They were not trying to escape the territory. They were racing to a destination. Their plan was insane. A final, nihilistic act of destruction. If they couldn't have the water, no one would. They would blow the illegal dam to kingdom come, erasing their crime in a catastrophic flood that would tear the heart out of the valley. The flats gave way to the broken country at the foot of the mountains. They galloped through a forest of needles, tall, jagged spires of rock that forced them into narrow, winding passes. The sounds of the chase were sharp and percussive, the frantic drumming of hooves, the sharp crack of dislodged rock, the strained, desperate breathing of horses and humans alike. They rounded a sharp bend and saw it, the dam. It stood as they had left it, a raw scar on the land, with a steady, powerful stream of water gushing from the breach they had created. But it was not unguarded. Drover and Ormond had already dismounted. A wagon, loaded with crates of mining explosives, stood nearby. The final, terrible phase of their plan was already in motion. As Beckett's party skidded to a halt, Silas Drover moved with surprising speed. He grabbed a lit stick of dynamite from a crate, its fuse sputtering angrily. But he didn't move toward the dam. He moved toward Nora. He seized her, pulling her back against his massive chest, his arm a steel band around her throat. He pressed the live dynamite against her temple. "That's far enough," Drover roared, his face a mask of sweat and fury. "One more step, Vale, and we all go up together." Beckett froze, his hand on his revolver. Nora stood rigid in Drover's grasp, her eyes wide but defiant, fixed on Beckett, while Drover held them at bay. Ormond worked with a cold, methodical haste. He was not a man of passion, but of process. He jammed 3 sticks of dynamite into the crack they had made in the dam, then began to uncoil a long fuse. "Let it go, Drover," Beckett said, his voice low and steady, a dangerous calm in the eye of the storm. "You lose, Vale," Drover spat. "You hear me? It's all over. We blow the dam, the evidence is gone, and this whole cursed valley washes away." Inspector Locke was already signaling to her deputies, who began to dismount, fanning out, looking for a clean shot. But Drover was shielded by Nora's body. "Shoot me, Silas," Beckett said, taking a deliberate step forward. His gun remained at his side. "Go ahead. The water will still flow. The truth will still come out." The words hung in the air, a simple, unshakable fact. Drover hesitated, his mad eyes darting from Beckett to the gushing water. His entire scheme, his entire empire, was built on a lie that was now, literally, pouring out onto the land. In that moment of hesitation, Ormond acted. He had finished his work. "It's primed. Silas," he yelled, He touched a lit match to the end of the long fuse. It sparked, caught, and began to burn. A thin, sizzling line of fire racing toward the heart of the dam. They had seconds. Nora saw it all. She saw the burning fuse. She saw Beckett's impossible choice. She saw the valley's lifeblood about to become its destruction. And she saw, lying on the ground near the wagon where the construction crew had dropped it, a long-handled grappling hook attached to a coil of rope. With a surge of pure adrenaline, she stomped down, hard, on Drover's instep with the heel of her boot. He roared in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She twisted, breaking free, and dove not for safety, but for the hook. She snatched it up, her hands sure and steady. There was no time to throw it. She ran, her legs pumping, closing the distance to the dam wall. As the fuse burned past the halfway point, she swung the heavy, four-pronged hook like an axe, its iron head whistling through the air. It connected with the burning fuse, severing it with a sharp, metallic thwack. The sizzling stopped. The tiny flame was extinguished less than a foot from the dynamite. The silence that followed was deafening. Drover, enraged at being outmaneuvered, forgot all about the dynamite in his hand. He threw it aside. It landed harmlessly in the mud and charged Beckett. The two men collided with the force of freight trains, a tangle of limbs and fury. They wrestled on the slick, muddy edge of the overflowing breach, their boots sinking in the treacherous ground. Ormond, seeing his plan in ruins, did what cowards always do. He ran. He scrambled for the far side of the dam, toward a rickety wooden suspension bridge that spanned the narrowest part of the canyon, his only escape route. The fight between Beckett and Drover was brutal and short. They were too close to the edge. Their combined weight and desperate struggle sent the muddy bank crumbling. They both went over, sliding down the slick embankment toward the churning water below. Drover, heavier and less agile, slid faster. He was about to go headfirst into the torrent when a hand shot out and grabbed the collar of his shirt. It was Beckett, hanging precariously from a tree root with one hand. He had instinctively reached out and saved the man who had tried to kill him seconds before. He held Drover there for a moment, the two of them suspended between life and death. Then, with a grunt of effort, Beckett hauled him back onto the muddy bank. Drover lay there, gasping, stunned. Beckett didn't give him time to recover. He rolled him over, pulled the handcuffs from his own belt, and cinched them tight around Drover's wrists. Suddenly, a new figure appeared on the trail above. It was EPH Deeks, who had finally caught up. He raised his pistol, taking careful aim at Beckett's exposed back. A single, sharp rifle crack echoed from the canyon wall. It was not Deeks's pistol. Deeks yelled, dropping his gun as if it were red hot. The hammer of his revolver, shattered by a bullet of impossible accuracy, spun away into the dust. On the ridge opposite, Maeve Cartwright stood, an old Sharps rifle resting easily in her hands. She nodded once, a grim guardian angel, then melted back into the rocks. Down below, Ormond had almost reached the bridge. He was halfway across when Nora, her face smeared with mud, her eyes blazing, reached the anchor post on her side. The main support rope was thick, tied in a heavy knot. She didn't have time to untie it. She pulled the large Bowie knife from the sheath on Beckett's abandoned saddle. With frantic sawing motions, she began to cut through the thick hemp rope. Ormond saw her. He stopped, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. "You!" he screamed. The rope groaned, its fibers parting. With a final, desperate slice, it snapped. The bridge, its tension gone, swung violently downward. Ormond cried out, losing his footing, and plunged not to his death, but into the deep, churning pool of muddy water that had formed below the dam. He surfaced, sputtering and flailing, alive but defeated, stripped of his dignity and covered in the filth of his own making. Inspector Locke and her deputies finally arrived, their guns drawn. Locke surveyed the scene Drover in handcuffs, Ormond trying to crawl out of the mud, Deeks clutching his shattered pistol, and the dam, its evidence preserved, pouring life back into the valley. She strode to the edge of the breach, where the ranchers and farmers from the town hall had begun to gather, their faces filled with awe. They were cheering, a ragged, joyous sound that echoed off the canyon walls as the first trickles of stolen water reached their thirsty ditches. Locke looked at the cuffed Silas Drover. "Silas Drover," she said, her voice carrying over the roar of the water. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, attempted murder, and theft of federal resources." Silas spat a wad of mud onto the ground. He glared at the cheering farmers, at Nora, at Beckett. "You people will forget," he bellowed, his voice raw with hatred. "In a year, none of this will matter. You'll forget." Nora stepped forward, her small frame radiating an immense, unshakable strength. She met his gaze without flinching. "When a woman remembers," she said, her voice clear and steady, "the whole town remembers." The camera in the mind's eye pulled back, leaving the scene of justice and chaos. It rose above the figures, above the broken dam, above the canyon walls. It soared into the vast, open sky, and the frantic pounding rhythm of the chase, the gunshots, the struggle, the heartbeat of the climax faded away, replaced by a single, powerful, overwhelming sound, the glorious, thunderous roar of rushing water, the sound of truth, unleashed. The world had shrunk to the muddy, chaotic stage of the dam. The air, thick with the smell of wet earth and spent black powder, rang with the sound of rushing water. It was the sound of a fever breaking. Franklin Ormond, his fine eastern suit a ruined mockery of brown sludge, was hauled from the water's edge by one of Locke's deputies, his teeth chattering with cold and humiliation. Silas Drover stood sullen and immovable, his massive wrists bound by the cold steel of Beckett's handcuffs, his eyes burning with a hatred that had been stripped of its power. E.P.H. Deeks, clutching his hand where the shattered hammer of his pistol had stung him, looked simply lost, a dog whose masters had finally been leashed, and later brought up from the town hall under guard. Judge Horace Pike arrived, his head bowed, the weight of his robes seeming to crush him into the earth. The architects of the valley's misery were assembled, their reign over Inspector Miriam Locke, her face stern, but her eyes holding a flicker of grim satisfaction, stood on a high rock overlooking the scene, her voice, clear and sharp, cut through the noise of the water and the rising murmur of the crowd. "By the authority of the Territorial Governor's Office," she declared, her words echoing in the canyon, "the public health quarantine of Alderwick Hollow is hereby declared null and void, having been found to be based on fraudulent claims and malicious intent." A ragged cheer went up from the ranchers who had gathered, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. "Furthermore," Locke continued, her gaze sweeping over the defeated men, "the water rights of Alderwick Hollow and all properties downstream along Bristlecone Wash are hereby restored to their rightful, deeded owners, effective immediately." This time, the cheer was a roar. It was a physical thing, a wave of sound that seemed to push back against the years of fear and uncertainty. Men who had been enemies over fence lines slapped each other on the back. Women wept openly, their hands clasped to their mouths. It was the sound of a future being given back. Downstream, at the head gates of the ranches, the news had already spread. Sluice gates that had been sealed for weeks were wrenched open. The first clean, clear gush of water, the lifeblood of the land, poured into the parched, cracked earth of the irrigation ditches. From a distance, you could see the joy erupting. A small child, who had known nothing but a dusty yard for weeks, could be seen splashing in the first muddy puddle forming by the horse trough. A rancher's wife sank to her knees, letting the cool water run over her hands as if it were a benediction. It was a baptism for the entire valley, amidst the celebration. Beckett and Nora stood in a quiet pocket of stillness. They were soaked, muddy, and exhausted, but they stood tall. The chaos swirled around them, but their world had narrowed to the space between them. Nora turned to him, her face streaked with dirt, her eyes clearer and brighter than he had ever seen them. The roar of the water, the shouts of the crowd, it all seemed to fade into a distant hum. "I took it off," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with a profound, unshakable certainty. She wasn't just talking about the physical act anymore. She was naming her transformation. The ring, the fear, the shame they tried to bury me in. She looked at him, and he saw not a trace of the hunted, haunted woman who had collapsed at his feet just days ago. Even the old name they used to trap me. I'm not who they said I was. I choose myself. Beckett's heart seized in his chest. He saw it all in that moment, the depth of her courage, the steel of her will, the incredible, terrifying beauty of her spirit, now completely unbound. He had seen men face down gunfighters with less courage than she had just shown. A half-beat of hesitation gripped him, a sudden, paralyzing fear. He was a man of dust and solitude, his heart a scarred and barren landscape. He was terrified of the hope she represented, terrified that it would be another thing the world would take from him. But the fear of losing her, of letting this one perfect, impossible moment slip away, was infinitely greater. He took a desperate step. It was not a step of desire, but of necessity. A step to close the final distance between a lonely past and a possible future. He reached for her, his arms going around her, pulling her in. He held her not just with his arms, but with his entire being. A silent, desperate plea for her to not be a mirage. They stood in the fine, cool spray thrown up by the breached dam, a mist that washed the dust from their faces. He lowered his head, and she rose to meet him. The kiss was fierce, but it was not hungry. It was a torrent of every emotion they had suppressed, the terror in the silo, the hope in the bunkhouse, the shared danger on the cliffside, the triumphant, impossible relief of this very moment. It was a kiss that tasted of clean water and second chances. His hand, which had found its way to her shoulder, tightened its grip on the rough wool of the blanket he had given her, a tangible link to the night their truths had been laid bare. And in the midst of the kiss, in the heart of the canyon, with the roar of the water as their witness, they broke apart and began to laugh. A pure, unrestrained, joyous laughter that mingled with the sound of the world being reborn. From a nearby rock, Maeve Cartwright let out a sharp, piercing whistle. She took off her worn beaver felt hat and flung it high into the air. To Truth she shouted, her voice thick with emotion, and to Love Inspector Locke, watching them, allowed a rare, warm smile to touch her lips. Her job was one of hard facts and harsh realities. But she was not immune to the poetry of a moment like this. "Tomorrow is for paperwork," she murmured to her deputy. "Tonight, the town has the right to dream." The celebration continued to swirl around them, but Beckett and Nora were in their own world. He reached into the inner pocket of his shirt, his fingers finding the soft, velvet ribbon she had given him in the seed shed. It felt warm from his body. As she watched, he took it out and carefully, deliberately, tucked it into the breast pocket of his shirt, the one directly over his heart. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. It was an unspoken vow, a promise he would carry with him always. The final scene is not one of chaos, but of quiet, profound peace. The late afternoon sun hangs low in the sky, bathing Lantern Step Canyon in a soft, golden light. The work of the law is done. The villains are gone. The ranchers are heading home, their voices carrying on the wind. 2 horses, a buckskin and a sorrel, stand patiently at the head of the trail leading back to Juniper Row. Below them, the old, familiar ditch is no longer a dry, cracked scar. It is full, running with a steady, life-giving current, the water glinting in the setting sun. Beckett stands by his horse, his hand resting on the saddle. Nora walks to him. She stops, and in the quiet of the canyon, she reaches out. She places her hand, her bare hand, with no ring to bind it into his. His rough, calloused fingers close around hers, a perfect fit. They stand there for a long moment, hand in hand, looking not at each other, but out at the healing land, their future as wide and as promising as the western sky. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and let us know your city or country so we can all connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you'd like to support us even more, please hit that hype button to help this story be heard by more people.